Inside the most sealed chamber of the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Tom Cruise. The world's biggest movie star turned the most dangerous witness alive, over a question no one dared ask in 20 years. How much has America truly paid for his faith? Cruise leaned on calm charisma, insisting he inspired millions, not controlled them. But just minutes later, Jasmine dropped evidence so explosive it didn't just shake his legacy, it ruptured an entire belief empire. Because if Tom Cruise was never just an actor, but the shining mask of a system built on fear, silence, and global loyalty, then what else have we blindly worshipped in the name of entertainment? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill, 8:57 a.m. The marble halls didn't echo with footsteps, but with tension. Inside hearing room 3A, security swept twice, then once more, before unlocking the chamber doors. Not for a president, not for a whistleblower, but for Tom Cruise, Hollywood icon, daredevil, and global face of Scientology, a movement cloaked in secrecy and power. This wasn't about a movie premiere. It was about belief used as influence, fame weaponized to shield abuse. Cameras were barred, but outside, media swarmed like it was a red carpet. This wasn't spectacle, it was reckoning. At the center sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, dressed in black, her focus sharper than any lens. As chair of the House Oversight Subcommittee, she wasn't just questioning Cruise. She was challenging the very machinery that let personalities dictate policy. Some in the room doubted her. They always did. But Jasmine knew this. When the truth threatens power, it never walks in welcomed. It kicks the door down. Cruise entered in a crisp navy suit, flanked by lawyers polished like mirrors. No applause, no nods. Jasmine stared him down, waiting for silence. Then she spoke, low and charged. Today we confront an empire with no borders, where faith is monetized, where fame shields harm, and where systems fall asleep while citizens are misled. Her words landed like steel. Cruise sat still, but his clenched jaw said what his face wouldn't. Behind him, Scientology reps sat stiff, rehearsed, but not untouchable. Not here. Scientology. To outsiders, a church. To defectors, a cage. Founded by sci-fi writer L. Ron Hubbard, it taught that humans were thetans, immortal souls burdened by ancient trauma. Auditing was the cure, via an e-meter, a tool critics called pseudoscience at best, psychological warfare at worst. Behind promises of clarity lay broken families, lawsuits, surveillance, and fear. And Cruise? He wasn't just a member. He was the movement's megaphone. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice silent now, but her gaze thundered. Your fame won't protect you. Not from this, not from me. Fear and the two. And just as the silence sharpened into a blade, the doors opened. He walked in like a man immune to consequence. Tom Cruise, perfectly tailored, posture measured, expression etched with effortless confidence. The brief roar from the hallway bled through the heavy doors. Cheers from fans, former supporters, and a few lobbyists who still worshipped him, not for what he believed, but for what he represented. A symbol, a myth. Not a man on trial, but a legend defending his legacy. That's how he wanted the moment to feel. But the rules inside this room were different. There were no agents whispering praise, no producers adjusting the lights, no cameras to capture his better angles. The applause was cut at the door. By law, the House Oversight Committee had ordered a total media blackout. No live streams, no photographs, no second takes. For once, Tom Cruise would have to stand alone, unscripted, and yet he still moved like the cameras were rolling. Every blink measured, every gesture calibrated. He nodded as if greeting old friends. When he reached the witness table, he adjusted the mic with the grace of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, he began, voice smooth, practiced, dangerously calm. Then came the line he'd rehearsed, the line his legal team had likely tested in focus groups. I'm not a politician. I don't create policy. My role in American life is cultural, not political. I uplift, I entertain. That's all. To anyone unfamiliar with the game, it sounded benign, even humble. But to Jasmine Crockett, who had spent years studying how power hides behind persona, it was an act of erasure, not explanation. He wasn't just distancing himself from Scientology's alleged abuses. He was erasing the possibility that his influence could even be questioned. And the injustice of it clawed at her, because she knew, better than most, how dangerous it was when a man like this, wrapped in the armor of admiration, got to decide where accountability began and ended. He had shaped narratives, swayed millions, stood shoulder to shoulder with those who called science a lie and therapy a weakness. Yet here he was, portraying himself as merely a bystander in the system he helped build. That wasn't humility, it was strategy, and it was working on some of the people in that room. As murmurs of approval rippled across the committee table, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. But something shifted behind her eyes. A tension, not born of anger, but of clarity. She realized in that instant that this wasn't just a hearing, it was a performance. And the lead actor still thought he was untouchable. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She had seen this maneuver before, polished denial wrapped in the language of inspiration. She leaned in slowly, not to match his tone, but to erase its illusion. Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind it, a weight born of courtroom battles, lived experiences, and the long silence of those who'd never had a mic to answer back. Culture, she said, is never innocent when it replaces truth with spectacle. It doesn't matter how many millions clap, how many headlines sing, or how many awards are stacked on a shelf. When culture becomes armor for harm, it stops being art. It starts becoming alibi. She held the pause, not for drama, but to let the words land where they needed to. Cruz met her gaze but said nothing. Around them, a few staffers shuffled uncomfortably, unsure whether to admire her poise or fear the fire she just lit. Because this wasn't a political performance, it was a moral cross-examination, and it was working. Cruz finally leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers laced like a man preparing for takeoff. His tone remained controlled, but something in it tightened, a slight drop in warmth, a trace of defensiveness he hadn't needed before. "With respect, Congresswoman," he began, his words clipped with precision. "Scientology has done what government systems rarely can. It has helped people, millions, navigate emotional crises, addiction, trauma, in ways no federal agency has ever been able to." He paused just long enough to let that comparison sting. "I'm not here to defend politics. I'm here because belief matters. And when people are abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them, they come to us, and we show up." His voice didn't rise, but its certainty was thunderous. In his mind, he wasn't answering a question. He was winning a war. But Jasmine hadn't come for a debate. She came for disclosure. And now she opened the file that would change the tone of the room forever. With deliberate care, she drew a heavy folder from beneath her notes. Simple in appearance, but weighed down by consequence. No theatrics, no dramatic flourish, just truth sharpened into pages. She placed it gently on the desk in front of her, then slid it forward so the microphones would catch every word that followed. "This," she said evenly, "is not conjecture. It's documentation. Over 200 pages of sworn affidavits, internal communications, and sealed civil complaints from individuals once loyal to Scientology, now broken by it." She paused just long enough to let that sink in. Then with a practiced hand, she flipped open the folder. The first page bore the initials of a woman who had been 15 years old when she was assigned to forced labor under spiritual rehabilitation. The second, a transcript of an internal tribunal where a victim of sexual misconduct was advised not to report the crime, but to undergo additional auditing to confront her own threatened weakness. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of the material spoke for itself. "This religion," she continued, "has been accused, credibly, repeatedly, of breaking families apart, of isolating members from the outside world, of leveraging fear and spiritual guilt to silence those who dare speak out." She gestured calmly to the large display behind her, which flickered on, revealing emails, real, time-stamped, between senior church officials discussing disciplinary lockdowns, the monitoring of uncooperative members, and the strategic containment of media exposure. The committee members leaned in. Several aides stopped typing. Even Cruz, for the first time, shifted in his chair. And that's when Jasmine delivered the blow that didn't come with volume, but with precision. "What you call healing," she said softly, "others remember as captivity. What you defend as belief, they endured as psychological control. And what this country cannot afford is to let charisma erase accountability." And if survivor testimony had pierced the illusion, then what she pulled next would tear it wide open. Jasmine reached down without a word and lifted a new file, thicker, stamped with a seal that silenced the room more effectively than any gavel ever could. A deep blue cover, embossed with the gold insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She placed it on the desk in front of her, then took a long breath before speaking. "The following contents," she said, "come directly from closed-door investigations conducted over the past 16 years by multiple units of the FBI. These are not opinions. These are intelligence reports, subpoena logs, internal memos, and financial tracking documents, most of which have never been made public. Until now." She opened the file with purpose, flipping past summary pages and case indices until she reached a set of documents marked with one word in thick black font: confidential. She began to read aloud. The tone in her voice didn't change, but the gravity behind it deepened. In 2013, Bureau analysts concluded that high-ranking Scientology executives authorized the formation of shell corporations in Luxembourg, the British Virgin Islands, and Nevada, none of which were registered under the church's official name. These entities funneled charitable donations and membership fees into offshore accounts used to purchase real estate, fund litigation, and pay undisclosed leadership salaries. She looked up. These were not minor errors. These were deliberate acts of concealment designed to protect over $168 million in untaxed assets. A beat of stunned silence followed. Then she flipped to another report. In 2016, she continued, field agents investigating whistleblower allegations discovered that certain branches of the church kept no electronic records at all, operating solely on verbal communication to avoid subpoena exposure. When they anticipated a raid, physical documents were burned. Security footage was wiped. Internal messages referred to it as spiritual sanitization. She paused and set the report down beside the first. One witness, formerly part of the church's legal defense team, testified that part of her job involved learning how to evade discovery without committing provable perjury. No one interrupted. Not one cough. Not one shift in a chair. What she had laid out was no longer a question of belief. It was a pattern of evasion so calculated it could only be described as institutional. And as the final image appeared on the monitor behind her, a network diagram tracing the flow of money across 3 continents, all converging at a handful of names. Jasmine didn't blink. Her voice, steady and low, carved through the silence like steel drawn in a cathedral. "You've told this country your church saves souls. But the evidence shows it's been saving money, quietly, illegally, and with absolute confidence that no one would dare pull back the curtain. But if the documents rattled the foundation, then the next words Jasmine spoke struck at the very heart of it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her strength now came from stillness, the kind that made people lean in before they even realized they were holding their breath. We've heard the numbers. We've seen the charts. But it's in the lived words of those who escaped that this machine finally reveals its architect," she said. She reached into a second compartment of her folder and removed a slim transcript, a single sheet yet dense with weight. "This is sworn testimony, taken under oath, from a former Sea Organization lieutenant with 3 decades of internal access to the church's compliance operations." She laid the sheet on the desk without drama and then spoke slowly, every syllable deliberate. "He describes a structure built not just on doctrine, but on silence, on fear, and on control. And at the center of that structure, above all public ranks and ceremonial titles, stood a civilian name. Repeatedly referenced in internal memos, event briefings, and private leadership huddles. That name," she said, lifting her eyes now to Cruz, "was yours." She allowed the weight of that moment to fill the space before continuing. The witness describes you not merely as a donor or ambassador, but as the patron saint of control, a title bestowed not by fans or marketing teams, but by internal enforcers within the church. She turned toward the committee members, some of whom had now shifted from skepticism to focus. This individual states that you were granted access to behavioral audit files, given verbal summaries of disciplinary cases, and routinely consulted on high-level image management decisions, particularly in situations where criminal liability was being weighed against public relations optics. Behind her, the screen changed. One quote filled it: simple, damning, and unembellished. He wasn't just protected by the system, he protected the system. She let the words hang, untouched, like smoke that no one dared wave away. Tom Cruise remained still. His face was composed, sculpted into the same performance-hardened calm he'd worn through 1,000 interviews, 1,000 press junkets. But something, just beneath the surface, had shifted. It was in the way he blinked half a beat too late, in the way his fingers tightened against the table. Not in anger, but in calculation. As if his mind, for the first time in years, had run out of scripted exits. And Jasmine saw it. She didn't press harder. She didn't need to. The silence in the room had already chosen sides, and all she had done was speak what everyone else had feared to say. And when the silence finally fractured, it wasn't with regret, it was with resistance. Tom Cruise leaned forward, elbows braced against the polished wood, his fingers interlaced like he was holding something back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Decades of global adoration had taught him that control was quieter than anger. "Who are you?" he said, the words low but cutting. "To sit there and question me?" He paused, letting the echo of his own voice fill the space. "I've spent my life building something that gave people hope. I've stood in front of nations after disasters. I've opened clinics, raised money, lifted people out of despair when no government even picked up the phone." He gestured barely. "I've given everything to this country, not with a title, but with action. And now I'm here, being dissected by someone who's never done half of what I've done." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that what this country's come to? Putting its servants on trial while its cynics take the mic?" There was no rebuttal from Jasmine. Not right away. She let the silence sit, thick and unmoving like fog before a storm. And then, with the steadiness of someone who had heard those words too many times in too many forms, she spoke. "I didn't come here to inspire," she said, her voice neither cold nor warm, only real. "That's your job. Mine is different. I was sent here to draw lines between truth and illusion, to make sure power doesn't get to rewrite the rules just because it knows how to smile through scandal." She folded her hands. "You talk about service, but service isn't measured by applause. It's measured by whether you let accountability through the same door that fame opened for you." Her eyes didn't leave his. "And you're right. This country has changed. It's just finally learning how to ask the questions it once let people like you avoid." The room didn't erupt. It froze. Outside, the reaction began to fracture like glass under pressure. Networks spun their angles. Commentators picked sides. Some called her disrespectful. Others said she was the only person in the room who remembered what duty looked like. Photos of Cruise leaving the chamber with a clenched jaw flooded the press. But inside that wood-paneled room, Jasmine Crockett had done what no court, no journalist, no whisper campaign had been able to do for 2 decades. She confronted the man, not the myth. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that truth doesn't care how long you've held the spotlight. It only asks what you've done with it. The room had heard paper. It had heard charts. It had even heard fire disguised as testimony. But it hadn't yet heard a voice that shouldn't exist in this space. Not until now. Jasmine Crockett took a long pause. Not to gather herself, she was already prepared, but to make space for the silence. A very specific kind of silence. The kind that comes just before something unignorable. She didn't raise her hand for effect. She simply turned her head to the committee clerk seated near the screen and said calmly, "Please play Exhibit 12. The lights dimmed. A soft, mechanical click echoed as the speakers activated. The screens around the hearing room flickered, first to black, then to a time-stamped video overlay reading, "Sealed audio, divorce proceedings, June 2012. For a moment, there was only white noise, and then a voice came through, not dramatic, not angry, just tired, careful, controlled. I was told I couldn't object. The sound was unmistakably Katie Holmes. Her voice, fragile in its steadiness, carried none of the polish of red carpets or rehearsed interviews. This was a woman speaking not to an audience, but to record, to history, to protect something bigger than herself. When the education session started, it was made very clear to me that I was not to interfere. I could observe, but I was not to comment. I was not to ask who was in the room. I was not to ask why our daughter was being asked about engrams. There were no images, only the glowing timestamp and her voice cutting through the dark. I didn't even know what an engram was. I wasn't raised that way. I wasn't raised in that system. But they said it didn't matter. That saying no meant I wasn't spiritually aligned. That if I resisted, it would prove I was unfit to guide her. A few people in the hearing room shifted in their chairs, not from boredom, from something colder, heavier, because what they were hearing wasn't an allegation. It was a slow, quiet unraveling of something that had long been hidden under NDAs, public smiles, and custody agreements no one was allowed to read. She was 5 years old. They wanted her to start processing memories from past lives. They said it was important to start early. They told me she'd been a warrior once, that she needed to be cleared so she could fulfill her role in this one. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. Her hands remained folded in front of her as the audio played on, and Tom Cruise, seated directly across from her, tightened his jaw ever so slightly. And when I asked for space, for time, they said I was projecting negative energy, that I was obstructing spiritual progress. I was her mother. But in that house, for those few months, I stopped feeling like a parent. I felt like a liability. The voice paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the speaker had to. There was one day I found her in a room with 3 adults I didn't know. She was sitting silently. One of them had an e-meter. I asked who they were. They asked me to leave the room. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't touch her, but they looked at me like I was the interruption, like I was the outsider in my own daughter's life. Then the audio stopped, abruptly, no fade, just silence. And in that silence, the entire chamber seemed to collapse inward. No one spoke. No one moved. Not even Cruz's attorneys, who moments earlier had been whispering behind their tablets, looked up. The air in the room had changed, not with volume, but with something slower, denser, an emotional gravity too sharp to escape from. Jasmine waited, exactly 6 seconds, long enough for the word to sink, short enough to keep them alive in everyone's mind. Then she looked across the room. "Mr. Cruz," she said, "would you like to respond?" His posture remained upright, perfectly still. He adjusted the cuff of his suit, then leaned forward, lips slightly parted, but no words came immediately. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, polished but pressed, the practiced cadence of a man used to controlling a narrative, but now painfully aware it was slipping. "That was taken out of context," he said, his voice careful. "That was an emotionally charged time, a custody negotiation. Things get said in those environments that don't always reflect reality." His words hung like a sheet caught in wind, visible but thin. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't even respond. She just watched him, the way his eyes flicked not toward her, but toward the committee, then the press box, then to the edge of the desk, looking for something, anything. That would hold, but there was nothing to hold, because Katie Holmes hadn't raised her voice in that recording. She hadn't accused him of abuse. She hadn't named names. She hadn't screamed, wept, or demanded justice. She had simply spoken like someone who had already made peace with not being believed, and recorded it anyway. That was what made it unshakable. And in that moment, Tom Cruise's denial couldn't touch it, because no one in the room had heard her fight him. They'd only heard her survive him, and in hearings like this, survival speaks louder than guilt ever will. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not stunned, not respectful. It was loaded, like a storm that hadn't yet broken, but everyone could smell in the air. A staffer coughed, another scribbled notes, but no one filled the space with commentary. Because Jasmine Crockett had done what no cross-examination or forensic audit ever could. She'd played the one thing the room wasn't prepared to hear: a mother, powerless in the presence of institutional control. And no amount of charm, prestige, or pre-rehearsed defense could undo that. Not in here, not anymore. But power never yields easily, and with his myth beginning to fracture, Tom Cruise did what he'd always done best: project conviction. His voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened, low, deliberate, the voice of a man who knew how to command a stadium without ever shouting. "I didn't force anyone," he said slowly, eyes scanning the room like he was drawing them back under his gravity. "That's not what I do. That's not what we do. I've never put a gun to anyone's head. I've never made a single soul stay. What I offer is belief, and people take it because they're starving for it. In a world full of broken promises and systems that fail them, I give them something to hold on to, something to live for." His words hovered like incense, warm, intoxicating, familiar. "You call it manipulation," he continued, "but I call it purpose. I call it choice." And in that moment, he wasn't just defending himself. He was defending the entire machinery of influence that had always followed him, protected him, elevated him. But Jasmine Crockett had seen what choice looked like when it came wrapped in dependency. She waited until he finished. Then she leaned forward, not with hostility, but with terrifying clarity. "You say it's a gift," she said, voice even. "But it's not a gift when it comes with conditions. It's not a gift when someone has to choose between community and compliance, between belonging and silence, between being healed and being owned." Her tone didn't waver. "You didn't need a gun. You had something more powerful. You had admiration. You had authority. You had belief. And you sold it in a form people were too afraid to question." The room didn't stir, but the weight of her words hung like a verdict. No one should be paid to deliver salvation that punishes doubt. No one should call it faith when fear is part of the contract. Cruise didn't respond, not right away, because there was nothing scripted enough to meet that kind of truth. But truth, once spoken aloud, has a way of unlocking the fear in others. And the next voice that rose in the room didn't come from Jasmine, but from across the table. Congressman Alan Worth, a former prosecutor from Illinois, known for his no-frills demeanor, adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and leaned forward over the microphone. "Mr. Cruise," he said slowly without inflection, "have you ever used your influence, your public standing, your access to media, or your role within the church to suppress allegations of abuse or misconduct, directly or indirectly?" The words landed like weight on stone. No decoration, no theatrical framing, just the blunt architecture of accountability. The room fell still again, but this stillness was different. There was a tension in it, not suspense, but expectation, as if the very oxygen had turned into a jury waiting for a simple answer. Across the room, cameras may have been banned, but every pen in the press box froze. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. This wasn't her moment. It was his. A moment to rise, to own, to confront. And Tom Cruise knew it. He straightened his back, his lips pressed together in an almost imperceptible movement. A familiar expression, refined, intentional. One that signaled discipline, not discomfort. But behind it, something flickered. A calculation, a narrowing of variables. He held eye contact with Worth for 2 seconds too long before speaking. Not long enough to appear shaken, but just long enough for everyone watching to wonder if he was. Then came the response. "I don't respond to questions built on false premises," he said, voice low, perfectly modulated. "That's not a question. That's an accusation wearing a tie." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch, but he also didn't answer. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He didn't offer explanation, evidence, or contradiction. What he offered instead was distance, crafted language, self-defense disguised as offense. And for a moment, it was almost enough. The line was clever, smooth, deniable. Until you listened again and realized what was missing: truth. Worth leaned back, said nothing more, because silence in this room had begun to mean something different. It no longer protected the powerful, it revealed them. And when Cruz refused to answer, the silence that followed didn't just stay in the room, it detonated across the country. By the time Jasmine Crockett's closing statement faded from the walls of Hearing Room 3A, the outside world had already moved. Fast, violently, relentlessly. The clip of her exchange with Cruz, just 93 seconds long, raw, unfiltered, no music, no edits, was posted by an aide before she'd even stepped out of the chamber. Within 3 minutes, it had crossed 1 million views. Within 10, 5 million. In less than 2 hours, it hit 20 million, crashing servers on 3 platforms simultaneously. It wasn't just being watched, it was being dissected, clipped, reposted, subtitled in 7 languages, shared by people who had never once agreed on anything. And for a few rare seismic hours, truth had momentum. The hashtag split the country in half like a political fault line. Cruise control surged first, posted by those defending him, insisting he was being targeted, framed, disrespected. Some argued the hearing was a stunt. Others called Jasmine a radical. A few called her worse. But then something else began to rise. Slow at first, then like a storm gathering over flat land. Let her speak. 3 words. No accusation. No venom. Just the quiet demand that someone like her, someone who didn't look or speak like the men Hollywood typically answered to, be heard without interruption, without narrative redirection, without apology. On TikTok, teens who'd only seen Cruz in Mission Impossible clips were now duetting his courtroom silence with blunt text overlays. This isn't Ethan Hunt. This is someone dodging a mother's voice. On Reddit, threads with hundreds of thousands of upvotes broke down the hearing frame by frame, where he blinked, where his fingers tensed, how many seconds he delayed before answering the question about his influence. On Twitter, a single quote from Jasmine went viral with no caption at all. No one should get paid to sell belief when obedience is the price tag. Within hours, the narrative Cruz had spent years building began to slip through the seams. But what changed everything wasn't the numbers. It was the names. Because in the hours that followed, former members of the Church of Scientology, many of them anonymous for years, began posting. Not vague statements, not cryptic allusions, declarations, real names, real faces, real pain. A woman named Bethany Rowe, who had disappeared from the public eye after leaving the Sea Org in 2014, posted a 2-minute video to Instagram, tears and rage sitting just beneath her voice. I watched that hearing, she said. I watched Jasmine Crockett say things I never thought anyone would say on record. And I want to say this now because I couldn't say it back then. He knew. Tom Cruise knew. Maybe not every detail, but he knew what happened to people like me, and he smiled for the camera anyway. The post hit 2 million views in an hour. The church released no statement. Then came Marcus Trevino, a former recruiter from the Celebrity Center in Los Angeles. In a TikTok live stream, his voice shaking, but eyes steady, he said, "We were told that anything involving Cruz needed to be pristine. No noise, no conflict. If someone said something negative near his name, we shut it down. That wasn't faith. That was fear disguised as PR." By nightfall, the story was no longer about belief. It was about control, power, and the cost of silence. Even cable news, which had tiptoed around Scientology for decades out of legal anxiety, began to crack. On MSNBC, an anchor known for her cautious tone looked directly into the camera and said, "We've been afraid to cover this. Let's be honest about that." But what Jasmine Crockett did today wasn't about religion. It was about asking what happens when truth runs into a fortress built from fame. And that fortress blinked. Meanwhile, a firestorm erupted in Hollywood. Some celebrities defended Cruz. Old friends, past co-stars, producers with multi-million-dollar stakes in upcoming releases. They posted statements of support, highlighting his work ethic, his generosity, his decades of success. But others stayed silent. A few unfollowed his accounts quietly. A few posted vague messages about believing survivors. And then a few, braver or perhaps just done being afraid, spoke directly. An anonymous message leaked to Variety from a current A-list actor read simply, "You can't call it a church when its loyalty is bought in fear and its silence is enforced through lawyers." By the next morning, opinion polls showed something that shook Cruz's PR team to its core. A majority of Americans now believed he had actively enabled misconduct within Scientology, even if he hadn't directly participated. The myth had ruptured, not because someone had screamed it down, but because someone had calmly, methodically, and unapologetically stood still and let the silence do its work. But for Jasmine Crockett, the backlash was personal. On one side, she was being hailed as fearless, principled, unshakable. Civil rights groups posted tributes. Law professors called her Exchange with Cruz, one of the most surgical interrogations of celebrity power in congressional history. High school debate teams analyzed her rhetorical control, but the other side came with knives. Threats filled her inbox. Memes distorted her image. Anonymous letters were slid under her office door with words like, "Watch yourself," and "You think this ends here?" She reported them, quietly, carefully, but she didn't stop. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't walked into that chamber to go viral. She hadn't confronted Tom Cruise to win applause. She had done it because truth, no matter how delayed, still deserves a witness. And now that truth had found air, it was refusing to leave. Every hour brought new stories, new names, new cracks in a structure that had held for too long under too much manufactured reverence. And every hour the same clip played again and again across the globe. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, looking him in the eye and saying words that were never supposed to be heard inside that room. No one should be paid to sell a belief when obedience is the price tag. And somewhere in that repetition, something extraordinary happened. The myth didn't just fall, it was seen for what it was, for what it cost, and for the silence it demanded until the right voice finally broke through. But when the myth begins to fall, it doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures, piece by piece, in boardrooms, in inboxes, in whispered meetings that never appear on calendars. The first call came just before dawn. A senior executive at one of the Big Five studios rang his legal department. He didn't give an order. He didn't express concern. He simply asked a question. "Do we have an exit clause tied to reputational damage?" It was the kind of question that doesn't come from panic, but from strategy, from survival. Because after 24 hours of viral fallout, Tom Cruise's name wasn't just trending, it was triggering liability reviews. By noon, a second studio had frozen all promotional planning for his upcoming $200 million action release. By the end of the day, 3 separate agencies confirmed that at least 2 streaming platforms were pulling out of talks for a long-rumored franchise deal. The momentum had flipped, not against his talent, not even against his legacy, but against his insulation, against the idea that no amount of documented truth could make a brand this big bleed. Behind closed doors, damage control meetings erupted. Executives used words like optics, brand risk, legacy volatility. Some argued for patience, pointing to Cruise's global market appeal. Others said nothing, because they'd seen this moment coming for years and knew it was now unavoidable. "We can't afford to look complicit," one senior VP said flatly in a leaked internal call. "We rode the wave, but this wave is turning on itself." Actors with pending contracts began requesting moral clauses be revisited. Several quietly asked their reps not to schedule press with him, and one producer, caught by paparazzi leaving a Los Angeles restaurant, said only 2 words when pressed about whether Cruise's next film was still happening. "We're evaluating." But it wasn't just Hollywood watching. From Geneva to New York, organizations that had spent years trying to penetrate the wall around Scientology finally saw their moment and moved with precision. That afternoon, Amnesty International issued a formal statement, urging the U.S. Department of Justice to open a full-scale public inquiry into the Church of Scientology's operations, citing persistent allegations of coercive control, psychological abuse, and obstruction of justice. Human Rights Watch followed just 2 hours later with a more pointed request. "We recommend the appointment of a special federal counsel to investigate the institutional use of celebrity status as a shield against accountability." Within hours, petitions were circulating, Hundreds of thousands of signatures from citizens demanding the IRS reevaluate the church's tax-exempt status. Survivors organized live streams. Legal experts began threading together the documents Jasmine Crockett had introduced in the hearing with previously suppressed testimonies. It no longer felt like political theater. It felt like the beginning of a reckoning. For years, critics of Scientology had been dismissed as fringe, bitter, or unreliable. But now they were backed by congressional record, and the woman who had delivered that record wasn't a pundit, a celebrity, or a YouTuber. She was a member of Congress with legal expertise, unimpeachable composure, and nothing to gain but the truth. Still, the opposition moved in shadows. One entertainment lawyer anonymously told Deadline that Cruz's legal team had already begun drafting letters to block further commercial damage, including threats of defamation suits against former members now speaking publicly. But even those tactics felt tired, because the truth was no longer hiding in dark corners. It was playing out in real time across millions of screens. Journalists dug deeper. Financial analysts began identifying nonprofit entities linked to Scientology that funneled millions through foreign holding companies, confirming the very financial patterns Jasmine had displayed in the hearing. One investigative team released a map of real estate owned by church affiliates in California alone, noting that dozens of properties were purchased under LLCs managed by shell organizations registered offshore. Each headline chipped away at the polished armor Cruz had worn for decades. Each revelation made the silence he offered during the hearing feel heavier, more suspicious, more damning. The entertainment world, long defined by its loyalty to profit over principle, had reached a crossroads, not because executives suddenly grew consciences, but because association now equaled risk, and risk in this industry was poison. One by one, the dominoes leaned. A prominent screenwriter tweeted that she had turned down a Cruz project 3 months earlier and now felt vindicated, not bitter. A casting director leaked that A-list actresses had begun requesting in writing that their names not appear in franchise negotiations tied to the actor. And a high-profile director, who had previously collaborated with Cruz on 3 blockbusters, released a short, blistering statement. There's a difference between playing a hero and being one. That line used to be blurry. Jasmine Crockett just made it clear. And through it all, the man at the center of the storm remained silent. Cruz's publicist declined interview requests. His legal team issued no formal statement. A spokesperson from the Church of Scientology released a 3-sentence denial, claiming coordinated defamation efforts and politically motivated attacks. But the press didn't bite. The moment had shifted. The usual methods, threat, retreat, redirection, were no longer effective. Because this wasn't just a PR problem, it was a systemic unmasking, and it had begun at the highest levels of government, on the record, with witnesses and evidence, and now, momentum. Even late-night hosts, usually cautious around legal landmines, began to weigh in. One joked, Tom Cruise spent his whole career trying to outrun consequences on screen. Turns out they run faster in real life. Laughter followed, but it didn't carry the usual sting of satire. It carried the tone of inevitability, of something finally undeniably cracking. The conversation shifted from if studios would sever ties to when and how publicly. Cruz's next scheduled appearance at a film festival was quietly canceled due to scheduling conflicts. A major global brand paused a multi-year sponsorship deal. And in the war rooms of powerful agencies and studios, decisions were no longer being made to protect a legacy. They were being made to protect the future. And Jasmine? She said nothing more that day. She didn't post a follow-up. She didn't hold a press conference. She simply walked out of the Capitol that evening under heavy security, flanked by 2 aides, phone dark in her hand. But across the digital sky, her words had already carved a path that no crisis manager could undo. When influence silences accountability, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes complicity. And that was the word now echoing in every meeting room from Burbank to DC. Complicity. Not belief, not inspiration, not even loyalty. And suddenly, for Tom Cruise, for the church, and for every institution that had quietly held the walls in place, that word was the most dangerous of them all. But when the institutions begin to tremble, the voices they once ignored become the center of the conversation. And Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman. She was the moment. 3 days after the hearing, 60 Minutes called. No filter, no spin. They wanted her. Not as a panelist, not as a commentator, but as the feature, the whole segment. A full 15 minutes of uninterrupted time in a national broadcast slot reserved for wars, whistleblowers, and the rare figures who broke through noise with something the country could no longer ignore. She didn't accept right away. She asked for the full terms. She asked for editorial transparency. She wanted to be certain she wouldn't be framed as angry, as performative, as the congresswoman who went viral. She was no stranger to how truth could be diluted by the very platforms that pretended to elevate it. When the camera rolled, Jasmine sat still. No bright colors, no soundstage glamour. A navy blue blazer, a bare desk, a simple microphone. "I didn't confront Tom Cruise," she said in the opening minute. "I confronted a system, a belief structure built on protection, of image, of control, of money, and I asked it to explain itself." It didn't. Her voice didn't rise once, but the force in her words never dipped. She spoke of Katie Holmes, of coerced silence, of tax law and financial shells, of the language of salvation weaponized against those too vulnerable to resist it. "People aren't just manipulated through violence," she said. "Sometimes they're manipulated through admiration, through awe, through the lie that someone powerful could never be dangerous." The segment aired at 7:03 p.m. Eastern. By 7:06, the internet was on fire again. But this time, it wasn't just echo chambers repeating what they had already heard. It was new voices, real-time reactions, families at dinner tables watching in shocked silence. Retired FBI agents tweeted confirmation of Jasmine's timeline. Former prosecutors began calling for state-level action. Independent journalists launched threads breaking down every phrase in Cruz's evasive answers, comparing them to Scientology's own internal language manuals. The momentum, once viral, was now institutional. And somewhere behind tinted windows and guarded gates, Tom Cruise was watching too. At 8:41 p.m., his team posted a statement. It was short, clean, crafted, but beneath the polish, the edges were sharp, not defensive, but wounded. "I have spent my entire adult life trying to uplift people, to help them see beyond their pain, to inspire them to rise. I've done so publicly, passionately, and without shame. I've been a believer, a teacher, a student. And now I find myself betrayed by the very people I fought to uplift." The words were deliberate. Betrayed, fought, uplift. But the country had heard something else. They had heard avoidance, not accountability, not apology. The statement didn't address Jasmine by name. It didn't mention the hearing. It didn't deny involvement in Scientology's inner circles. It didn't confront a single piece of evidence. Instead, it framed him as the victim of politics, of public opinion, of a world that had somehow turned on its hero. That same night, the top comment on his post read, "If truth feels like betrayal, maybe it was never truth you were protecting." It was shared 60,000 times. But what rattled his camp more than the hashtags or the trending charts were the headlines from outside the entertainment sphere. The Atlantic ran a feature titled, "Celebrity Isn't Innocence: Why Tom Cruise's Legacy is Now a Public Reckoning." The Washington Post ran a lead editorial, "The Price of Silence, Paid in Fame." And in The Guardian, a former Scientology member published a full exposé detailing a decade of internal control practices, naming Cruise not as an actor, but as an active benefactor in the church's highest privilege circles. For the first time in his career, Tom Cruise wasn't playing a role. He was being written into someone else's story. And Jasmine? She didn't respond to his statement, not publicly, not immediately. She returned to work. She held constituent meetings. She reviewed committee notes. But she knew they were watching her now, waiting for her next sentence, her next pause, her next choice, and she would make it carefully, because this wasn't about going viral anymore. This was about what happens when power tries to declare itself the wounded party after a lifetime of building walls to keep itself above consequence. And Jasmine Crockett had never feared walls. She'd been sent to break them. And just when it seemed the air in the chamber could not carry one more ounce of consequence, Jasmine Crockett rose. The rustle of suits, the shifting of committee folders, even the dimming camera lights, all stilled like prey sensing a predator in the room. No theatrics, no shouting. She didn't adjust her microphone or clear her throat. She simply stood there, framed by the harsh congressional lights above, and the weight of every eye now fastened to her like a vice. This wasn't the beginning of a closing remark. This was the detonation. Her voice was low but blade sharp, like it had been honed on betrayal. "You want final words?" she said, scanning the room. "Not for approval, but for witnesses. Then hear this." She leaned forward ever so slightly, palms resting against the mahogany desk that had seen decades of confessions, compromises, and cover-ups. "If light," she paused, letting the silence draw in like a breath about to be broken. "If light is only used to cast longer shadows for the powerful, then maybe it's not light we need more of." Several heads tilted, brows furrowed. She didn't flinch. "Maybe what we need is a little more darkness, so we can finally see the truth." It was not a flourish. It was a verdict, and it hit the room like a hammer swung through stained glass. A second passed, then two, and the silence wasn't still. It was electric, buzzing with the pressure of a truth too raw to be politely digested. Across the table, one senior representative, gray hair, veteran of a dozen oversight committees, removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and set them down as if even glass could no longer shield him from the clarity Jasmine had unleashed. Chairman DeLuca tried to respond, but his throat caught the moment like gravel in a clutch. "Congresswoman Crockett," he finally managed, "that will be entered as your final statement in today's record." No one clapped, because this wasn't Hollywood. This was a war fought in suits and paper, and Jasmine had just dropped a bomb that no one was prepared to disarm. And then, the vote. You could feel it before the first "I" was called. The tension, the institutional reluctance battling with moral inevitability. They weren't just voting on Scientology. They were voting on whether they had the spine to confront power that wore a charming smile and global box office numbers. Representative Callahan from Utah hesitated a moment too long before casting his "I." You could see the flicker in his eyes. Career or conscience? He chose conscience. Barely. One by one, the votes came in. "Aye. Aye. Nay. Aye. Aye." Then a pause. 17th vote. "Aye." Chairman DeLuca closed the roll, exhaled slowly, and announced the result. By a vote of 17-3, the committee hereby authorizes the formal investigation into the Church of Scientology and its affiliated financial and psychological operations. The words didn't echo. They landed. A moment later, the gavel struck wood. Not as punctuation, but as a seismic shift. Outside the chamber, the world didn't wait. Cable news cut away from weather updates mid-sentence. Push notifications hit phones like a digital thunderclap. Congress launches official probe into Scientology. Crockett's final statement goes viral. "We need more darkness to see the truth." On the Capitol steps, reporters swarmed, elbowing for space, flooding live streams with frantic updates. But Jasmine, she didn't stop for cameras. She didn't hold a press conference. She walked past the microphones with the calm of someone who understood that some fights weren't meant to be framed in 30-second sound bites. Her message had already been delivered, and it had detonated exactly where it needed to, in the spine of a government that had, for too long, pretended some powers were too soft to be dangerous. The vote was over, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the kind of silence that comes just before the earthquake hits. When the news broke that Tom Cruise had suspended all public appearances and terminated his involvement in every upcoming film project, it didn't come through a tearful press conference or some late-night talk show apology. It came through a brief, calculated statement from his longtime publicist. 47 cold words posted to social media. No questions taken. No follow-up. Mr. Cruise will be stepping back from public life for the foreseeable future. He thanks his fans for their support. That was it. The man whose face had been on more movie posters than most actors could dream of was gone in an instant. Studio executives scrambled. Franchises crumbled. Hundreds of millions of dollars were vaporized in days. But what haunted the public wasn't the silence. It was the realization that no one truly knew who Cruise had been serving all these years. Not Hollywood, not the audience, but something far more concealed, something far more powerful. And now, thanks to one woman's unrelenting questions, the curtain had finally been pulled back. Inside the Capitol, a different kind of shockwave had just been set in motion. Following the explosive hearings, the House Oversight Committee moved swiftly. The Cultural and Religious Influence Transparency Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. 17-3. It was more than a bill. It was a declaration. No more shadow alliances between ideological organizations and public figures. No more unchecked influence on vulnerable minds cloaked in celebrity charisma. The law mandated full financial transparency for any public figure with ties to religious or quasi-religious institutions. It gave legal recourse to victims of ideological coercion, and for the first time in U.S. history, it established an investigative body specifically to audit and regulate the lobbying practices of belief-based organizations. The message was clear. Belief could be free, but not bought. Faith could be personal, but never weaponized for power. It was a legislative thunderclap that rewrote the rules, and the woman behind it was just getting started. Outside the chamber, the world was watching. News outlets ran continuous coverage of Jasmine Crockett's final words at the hearing, words that had turned viral, quoted like gospel. If light is only used to cast shadows behind power, then maybe we need the dark to see the truth. That line echoed across every platform, in every language. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was a reckoning. Time magazine moved fast. Within days, the editorial board unanimously voted to feature her as the woman who reshaped American belief. The cover showed Jasmine standing alone beneath the storm-darkened Capitol dome, her hands folded calmly, the crucifix on her necklace gleaming against her black suit. The expression on her face was not triumph. It was resolve. Not the resolve of someone who had just won, but of someone who knew the battle was only just beginning. Inside the feature, a bold subtitle read, "Not all revolutions require blood. Some just require clarity." What followed next could not have been scripted, though Hollywood tried. In a move that stunned the entertainment world, The Church of Power, a Netflix-backed documentary, premiered less than 2 months after the hearings ended. Narrated by a former Scientologist turned whistleblower, the film chronicled decades of hidden manipulation, psychological conditioning, and financial coercion tied to the organization's most powerful celebrity members. Halfway through the film, the screen cuts to a congressional clip, Jasmine Crockett staring down Tom Cruise across the hearing room. The moment freezes. The narrator's voice cuts in. Power used to look like a throne. Now it looks like a smile on a movie screen. The impact was electric. The documentary became the most-watched nonfiction premiere in streaming history within 48 hours. The public didn't just watch, they reacted. Protests erupted outside Scientology centers in Los Angeles, Clearwater, and even London. Anonymous testimonials flooded online forums, and somewhere in a quiet mansion tucked in the Hollywood Hills, a man who once jumped on couches now sat alone, surrounded by silence too loud to bear. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was never about Tom Cruise. It was about the idea that influence, when left unchecked, becomes control. And that control, when wrapped in charisma, becomes invisible. She had faced down a living symbol of that truth, and she had survived. More than survived, she had shifted the axis. People once too afraid to speak now found their voices. People once dismissed as conspiracy theorists were now being listened to. Jasmine hadn't just questioned a man, she had questioned a system, and won. But even she understood the cost. In interviews following the hearings, she admitted she no longer walked freely without security. She admitted her emails were constantly monitored, her phone tapped more than once. When you shine a light into a place where money and belief hold hands, she told CNN, you don't just get heat, you get fire. Yet still, she pressed forward. In one of the final scenes of The Church of Power, viewers see raw footage never aired on television. It's Jasmine, standing outside the Capitol building after the hearings, flanked by reporters. A young woman breaks through the crowd holding a sign that reads, "I left because you stood." Jasmine doesn't cry. She just nods, says thank you, walks on. For those who'd been watching, for those who'd grown up idolizing faces on movie screens only to question their own beliefs in adulthood, Jasmine Crockett had become more than a name. She had become a fulcrum, a point upon which history had pivoted. She did not scream. She did not grandstand. But she did something more dangerous. She told the truth, and she made it impossible to ignore. So when the final credits rolled on the documentary and millions sat stunned in their living rooms, there was only one question left echoing through America's mind. If the stories we tell shape the world we live in, who gets to choose which ones we believe? As the credits rolled on the Church of Power and the final frame faded to black, a silent silhouette of Jasmine walking alone past the Capitol at dawn, a deeper question began to rise, not just from the screen, but from the silence it left behind. What does it mean when truth finally speaks louder than myth? In a country built on ideals yet often shaken by contradictions, Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with one of the most powerful symbols of modern celebrity wasn't merely a political collision. It was a mirror held up to a nation addicted to charisma, lulled by influence, too often blinded by the glare of icons while ignoring the quiet decay beneath. But Jasmine didn't come to this fight with a thirst for attention. She came armed with something far rarer, the courage to name power, not just possess it. For decades, Tom Cruise had embodied a kind of American invincibility, the untouchable, ever-grinning embodiment of success, discipline, and curated perfection. And Scientology, shielded by money and mystery, had thrived in the gaps of accountability, selling salvation like a subscription and silencing dissent with fear masked as faith. When Jasmine stood up, she wasn't just standing against a man. She was standing against the idea that fame was above scrutiny. That belief, if branded well enough, could be sold without question. That influence, if televised, was the same as truth. And that's where the lesson lives. It lives in her refusal to be dazzled, in her refusal to lower her voice just because others had raised theirs first. It lives in her unwillingness to let inspiration become a license for manipulation. Because inspiration without accountability is just performance. And performance, when weaponized, is not harmless. It's structural violence, dressed in applause. The deeper human lesson isn't that Jasmine won, it's that she chose not to be small in a room that was designed to shrink her. When the cameras turned to Cruise, he glowed. When they turned to Jasmine, she burned. Not with rage, but with resolve. She didn't ask the public to choose sides between a movie star and a politician. She asked them to choose between comfort and conscience. And America, one finally, chose conscience. But conscience always comes with a price. Jasmine had no entourage, no PR firm, no legal team rehearsing her sound bites. What she had were stories, those of mothers, children, whistleblowers, and doubters who'd lived under the suffocating grip of belief systems engineered to control. She carried their weight on her back and brought it into a room built for spectacle, not truth. She didn't lecture, she listened first. And when she spoke, it wasn't scripted, it was lived. This story is not about religion versus government. It's not even about Tom Cruise versus Jasmine Crockett. It's about a quieter war, the war between illusion and integrity, the war between what we're sold and what we know. And every nation fights it in one form or another. In this version, America finally saw that being inspired isn't enough when the source of that inspiration is built on secrecy, intimidation, and unchecked power. In the days following the hearing, millions rewatched the confrontation, not for the drama, but for the clarity. For once, a public official did not retreat into vague diplomacy. Jasmine didn't say no comment. She said, "This is manipulation." She didn't hide behind legalese. She pointed and named, exposed and endured. She withstood smear campaigns, threats, even isolation from her own colleagues. And she never flinched. There's a moment in every seismic shift, a line where history bends. For many, that moment came not in Jasmine's final words, but in the pause just before. That breath, where she looked around the room, saw every eye on her, and didn't blink. In that moment, power shifted, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer feared it. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.